There's a question my grandfather used to ask whenever two strangers ended up sharing a fire they hadn't planned to share. Who needed who more? He wasn't talking about survival. He meant something deeper, that thing underneath pride and silence and years of being told the world was divided into the ones who mattered and the ones who didn't. He meant that strange gravity that pulls two people into the same moment despite every force that should have kept them apart. I used to think I understood what he meant. Then I spent one night in a canyon I'd never meant to ride into, next to a man I'd been taught to fear, listening to the sound of iron teeth biting into something that had no business being caught. By the time the sun came up, I wasn't sure of anything I thought I knew about belonging, about land, about the word enemy. I wasn't even sure what kind of man I was. I just knew I'd made a choice in the dark before I had time to think about it, and that choice had made everything else irrelevant. Some nights still find me at the edge of that memory, crouching in the scrub, hands shaking, smelling blood and pine and something like the beginning of a different life. This is what happened. I keep a small leather journal in my left breast pocket, which is a habit my mother called precious and every man I've ridden with has called peculiar. I don't write in it every day, only when something happens that I suspect I'll argue with myself about later. Only when I need a witness to my own thinking. I didn't write anything that night. My hands were too busy shaking. My name is Callum Hart, and I was 26 years old and 3 days lost when I heard the sound. Not lost in a romantic sense, not the kind of lost that means you're finding yourself. Lost the way a man gets lost in high desert country when his compass cracks on a rock during a bad slide, and he's been following the wrong ridgeline for 2 sunsets because he was too stubborn to admit the first one didn't look right. Lost the way that starts as inconvenience and becomes something quieter and more honest. The kind where you realize that the land doesn't know your name, has never known it, and couldn't be less concerned about learning it. I was riding for a spread called the Arroyo Mesa outfit, 2 days east, and given my current miscalculation, maybe 4. I had 1 canteen at 3/4, a bedroll, half a side of salt pork, and a roan mare named Cress who had expressed her opinion of my navigation primarily through long, theatrical sighs. I'd been following a canyon creek south, hoping it bent toward lower elevation, when the lights started going gold, and I made the decision to stop before dark rather than risk another bad slope in low visibility. I'd been making smart decisions for the last 12 hours. They hadn't done much good, but I kept making them. I unsaddled Cress near a flat boulder where she could reach the creek grass. I built a small fire, small because I wasn't sure whose country I was moving through, and I had enough problems without adding that one. I ate half the salt pork cold because I couldn't justify the fire size needed to heat it properly. I opened the journal, looked at the blank page, couldn't find the words, and closed it again. I sat there in the failing dark, listening to the creek and the distant complaint of some bird that seemed just as annoyed at me as Cress was. Then I heard it. Not an animal sound exactly, or it was, but the wrong kind. A sound that landed in my chest wrong, like a word mispronounced so badly you can feel the speaker's pain. It was low, controlled. Whoever or whatever was making it was working very hard to keep it from becoming something else. Cress lifted her head from the grass. Her ears went flat. I sat perfectly still for 10 seconds, which felt like a geologic era. Then I picked up the rifle, checked it by feel the way you do in poor light, and walked toward the sound. I want to say I was brave about it. I wasn't. My heart was going at a pace that would have embarrassed me to describe, and I was walking in a slight crouch that served no tactical purpose whatsoever except to make me feel like I was doing something thoughtful. The creek made too much noise and the scrub brush kept catching my boot heels, and I stopped 3 times to listen, each time hearing nothing, and then the sound came again, closer, controlled, that same quality of something enormous trying to stay quiet. I came around a shelf of limestone and saw him. He was sitting against the base of a ponderosa pine, and my first thought, before the fear, before the calculation, before any of the things I'd been taught to think, was that he was the largest man I had ever seen in my life. Not in the exaggerated way people talk about size in campfire stories. Actually, physically, genuinely enormous. His shoulders were wider than the trunk of the small juniper beside him. His legs, stretched out in front of him, were long enough to have belonged to a different species. His left foot was in a bear trap. The trap was an old double-spring model, the kind with teeth like a broken saw blade. and it had closed on his ankle with the kind of conviction that makes iron feel like fate. He'd already tried working it. I could see that from the disturbed earth around him, the way the pine needles were scraped into ridges by his boots. He hadn't screamed. Whatever sound had reached me across 200 yards of canyon scrub was the outermost limit of what he'd allowed himself. He heard me come around the limestone before I'd finished the motion. His head came up and he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as absolute, no surprise in it, no fear that I could read, just a complete and total assessment. The way a hawk looks at something it's deciding about. Quick, final, already working toward a conclusion. He was Apache. I knew enough of the region to understand that, and enough of recent history to know what that meant for both of us. And I had perhaps 2 seconds to make a decision that wasn't really a decision at all, because the trap had been there before I arrived, and the blood soaking through the leather wrapping at his ankle was real, and whatever I was afraid of wasn't more pressing than what I was looking at. I held up my left hand. Not a gesture of superiority, I wasn't foolish enough for that. Just, I see you, I'm not raising the rifle. He watched me with that same complete stillness. I lowered the rifle barrel toward the ground and crouched down about 10 feet from him, which put us at something like eye level, though I was still looking up slightly because even seated against a tree, he was somehow a presence that occupied vertical space. "That trap," I said, and then ran out of words, which was unusual for me. I gestured at it. The universal sign for that thing you're already aware of. He said something in Apache that I didn't speak. His voice was even controlled. Whatever it wasn't a greeting and it wasn't a threat. It was more like a statement of terms. I nodded as though I'd understood, which I hadn't, and reached slowly into my jacket for the journal. Not because I meant to write anything, but because I'd realized the release spring on the trap was a particular design, and I needed something flat and narrow to lever it safely, and the journal's reinforced spine was the only thing I had that might work. He watched me take it out. His eyes went to it briefly, the journal, the worn leather, the strap I'd wound around the cover because the clasp had broken 6 months ago. Then back to my face. I showed it to him. "This is what I'm using." A pause. Then, slowly, he extended his right leg outward slightly, giving me better access to the trap without moving the injured ankle. A controlled act of practical cooperation. Nothing more, nothing less. I got to work. Bear traps of that era had 2 springs, one on each side of the jaw, and to open them you had to depress both simultaneously. With 2 hands and the right tools, it was a 10-minute job. With a journal spine and hands that wouldn't quite stop trembling in poor firelight next to a man who had every reason not to trust me, it took me the better part of 40 minutes. I don't remember exactly what I said during those 40 minutes. I talk when I'm nervous, another habit my mother called precious and my writing companions called exhausting. I wasn't talking to him particularly. I was talking to the trap, to myself, to the failing light, to the general situation. I said things like, "All right here, no, not that way, and this spring's rusted, of course it is." And at one point memorably I said, "I'm going to need you to not move for about 30 seconds. And then remembered he couldn't understand me. And then he held perfectly, absolutely still for exactly the amount of time I needed, which suggested that tone carries more than words do, or that he was a very good guesser, or both. When the jaws finally released, with a sound like a sentence ending, I heard him exhale for the first time. Not dramatically, just a single controlled breath that told me what the 40 minutes of silence had been costing him. I sat back on my heels and looked at the ankle. Even through the leather wrapping, the damage was significant. The teeth had compressed rather than severed, which was the better outcome, but swelling was already visible, and there was blood on 3 of my fingers that I didn't quite remember getting there. He looked at the ankle too for a long, assessing moment. Then he looked at me. He said something, short, direct, with that same quality of complete certainty in his voice. I said, "You're welcome," without thinking about it, and then felt slightly embarrassed by the assumption. He didn't smile, but something in his expression shifted, a small recalibration, the way a scale settles when the weight has been correctly measured. I sat there in the scrub in the growing dark, the freed trap beside us like a confessed crime, listening to the creak and to Cress snorting somewhere behind me, and thought about how I was going to explain any of this in my journal later. I brought him to my fire. That's a simpler sentence than the reality of it. He was using a broken juniper branch as a crutch. refusing my arm with a slight turn of his shoulder that was more communicative than most words I'd heard that year, moving with a steady, deliberate gait that I could tell was costing him considerably, and that he had no intention of letting me see the cost of. I walked beside him at a slight distance, close enough to be present, far enough not to be hovering, and felt obscurely that I was being evaluated on this too. At the fire I heated water in my single tin pot. He sat with his back to the limestone boulder, same instinct as any experienced man in unknown company, the solid wall behind, and watched me with that hawk assessment as I cleaned the wound as best I could with the cloth strips I cut from my spare shirt. He flinched once, when I worked the cloth into the deepest compression mark, and it was such a small, controlled flinch that I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't been watching carefully. I noticed it, I didn't react to it. That seemed important. I wrapped the ankle tightly with the remaining strip, using a knot my father had taught me that held without cutting circulation. And when I sat back, he looked at the wrapping for a moment and then said something brief that had the cadence of acknowledgement. "Callum," I said, touching my own chest. Then I pointed at him a question. He looked at me steadily. The fire was between us, and in its light his face was all plains and shadow, deeply lined in ways that suggested neither age nor hardship, but something more like accumulated decision. As if every significant choice he'd made had left a small physical mark, and he had made many significant choices. He said a name. It was long, and I knew immediately I was going to mispronounce it, and that this was going to matter to me in a way I couldn't fully account for. He watched me try it twice. The second time he made a small motion with his hand, close enough, but there was something in his eyes that might have been the very beginning of something that was not quite humor. I pulled the journal from my pocket, which now had a bent spine and 2 smears of his blood on the cover, and turned it over in my hands. He watched that too. "I write things down," I said, "things I don't want to forget." He said nothing, but he didn't look away. The fire settled between us, and Cress sighed somewhere in the dark, and the creek kept going the way water does, indifferent to everything happening on its banks, carrying everything downstream anyway. I didn't write anything that night. I didn't need to. By the second hour, I'd stopped pretending I was going to sleep. We sat on opposite sides of the fire, him with his back to the limestone, me with mine to the scrub, and we kept a kind of companionable silence that I hadn't had with another person in years. Not the silence of 2 men with nothing to say. That silence has its own pressure, a waiting quality, like held breath. This was something else. The silence of 2 men who understood that speaking would change what was happening, and that what was happening had a value that neither of them could quite name yet. I mention this because I am, by nature and by compulsion, a talker. My silence in that second hour was not natural. I was working at it the way you work at holding a stream-crossing horse steady, conscious effort, moment to moment, trying not to disrupt something that was balancing itself. Cress solved this by walking to the fire and standing directly behind me with her chin on my shoulder, which she did when she was curious about something she considered my responsibility. I introduced her with one hand raised toward her nose and said, "Cress. She has opinions about everything." He looked at the horse for a long moment, taking in the lean muscle, the good cannon bones, the quality of her even in firelight, and made a sound in his throat that Cress apparently found satisfactory, because she moved her chin from my shoulder and stepped forward without hesitation, which she had never done with a stranger in the 4 years I'd had her. He ran one hand down her neck without ceremony, the way a man does who has known horses from before he could name them. I watched this and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. The wound required more attention around midnight. The swelling had continued, which I'd expected, and when I checked the wrapping, he held the leg steady with the absolute neutrality of a man who has lived long enough with pain to treat it as information rather than complaint. I redid the binding. I told him, uselessly, that he should avoid bearing full weight on it for several days, and that if the color turned wrong, he'd need a proper physician, and that I had 2 days of writing that I was now uncertain about, and that he was welcome to. I stopped. I hadn't planned the end of that sentence, and in the stopping I realized I didn't know how to finish it. Welcome to what? Follow me east. Return with me to a spread that had its own history with Apache land and Apache raids, and the complicated, ugly arithmetic of a territory that didn't know yet what it was going to be. He was watching me with that assessment again. He'd caught the stop. I said slowly, I don't know the right thing. I'm not going to pretend I do. A pause. He said something that I didn't understand. Then after a moment he said one word in English, rough, accented, clearly retrieved from somewhere deep in memory, and the word was, land. I waited. He made a gesture outward, wide, encompassing, not pointing at any specific direction, but at all directions at once. The canyon, the mesa above it, the desert beyond. The territory that the surveys called by names that had been assigned to it, by men who'd arrived, after the names were already there. Your land, I said. He looked at me evenly, not confirming or denying, just, you said a thing, sit with it. I sat with it. I didn't set that trap, I said after a while, and knew the moment the words left me how insufficient they were, because that was true and also completely beside the point. The trap was there. The trap had been set by someone. The land had been the kind of land where that trap got set. None of those facts dissolved because I personally hadn't done the setting. He didn't answer, but something in his expression did something complicated. Not absolution, not condemnation, just acknowledgement that I'd said a real thing. I picked up a small stick and turned it in my hands, the way I fidget when I'm trying to think honestly. I'm a cowboy, I said. Not a soldier, not a settler with a deed. I follow cattle. That's what I've done since I was 17. I paused. I don't know if that matters. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, why? The single English word, a question. Why what? He made the outward gesture again, then pointed at me. Why are you here? I'm lost, I said. 3 days, bad compass. Something happened in his face. Controlled, subtle, the absolute minimum expression. That was entirely and unmistakably human amusement. He looked at the creek, at the canyon walls, at the stars above the Ponderosa Ridge, and then back at me with the look of a man who has navigated this country for his entire life and has some thoughts about how one gets lost in it. I know, I said, I know. The fire popped, crest shifted. The creek made its steady, indifferent argument. And somewhere in the next hour, I can't tell you exactly when, because there was no dramatic moment, no declaration, just a gradual change in the quality of the silence. We stopped being two men waiting to see what the other would do, and became two men simply sitting with what was. He told me things in the second part of the night, the way a man tells things when he has calculated that telling is not weakness. Not in long narratives. His English was limited, and he didn't waste it on decoration. He used it the way he used gesture, precisely, economically, each word chosen for what it carried rather than for how it sounded. He built understanding the way you build a shelter in country you know well, using what's available, wasting nothing. He had ridden out alone 3 nights back, which I understood from context was unusual. Something he did sometimes. Thinking time in a way I recognized because I'd had my own version of it. Those long solo rides that weren't about destination, that were about getting your mind to a place where it could hear itself. The trap had caught him in the dark, going down toward the creek. He'd been in it for most of a day before my fire reached him. I did the arithmetic and felt something cold move through me. A day. Sitting against that pine tree with iron teeth in his ankle, alone, in country that was technically, by the agreements that kept being rewritten by men who hadn't asked him, no longer his to move through freely. Were you afraid? I asked. He looked at me, not offended by the question, assessing it. Not of the trap, he said. He paused, clearly searching for the word and finding it with the precision of a man who doesn't waste vocabulary. Becoming a story. I stared at him. A chief, he said, caught. He didn't gesture at the trap. He didn't need to. The humiliation wasn't in the iron. It was in what it would mean. What it would be made to mean, who would tell it, and what they would do with the telling. I thought about my journal. I thought about the blood on its cover. I thought about all the things that get written down by people who were present, and all the things that get changed in the writing. I won't tell it wrong, I said, if I tell it at all. He looked at me for a long time. That hawk assessment, that final quality. Then he nodded once. A different kind of nod from the ones I'd seen him make, not acknowledgement, but something closer to decision. I didn't understand yet what he'd decided. I only knew that something had happened in the space of that nod that I didn't have the words for, and that the journal in my pocket felt heavier than it had before. He asked me, toward 3 in the morning, about the cattle. Not because he was interested in cattle, I understood that. but because he was interested in the shape of my days, the mechanics of my life, and cattle were what gave my days their shape. We talked, and talked is the right word here, because he had stopped conserving his English, and I had started using my hands and tone in ways that crossed language, about the mechanics of ranging, about winter feed and spring drives, and the particular stubbornness of longhorns in canyon country. He knew the canyon country, knew it in the bones of the earth way that comes from being raised in it, not from maps. He told me things about the creek I was sitting next to, which way it bent 10 miles south, where it went underground for a quarter-mile and came back cold, where the limestone shelf made a natural crossing that wouldn't break a horse's leg in the dark. He was telling me how to stop being lost. I realized this slowly, sitting there, turning a stick in my hands. He was giving me the route out, not because I'd asked. Not as an exchange, he hadn't named it as one. He was just telling me the land, the way someone tells you about a place they've lived long enough to love, because the telling is its own form of generosity. I wrote it down in the journal. Not the names, those were his names in his language, and I didn't try to transliterate them. But the landmarks as he described them, the distances, the turns. 3 lines of notes that would get me back to Arroyo Mesa by tomorrow afternoon if I left at first light. He watched me write, watched the journal the way he'd watched it before, not with suspicion, but with that quality of attention he brought to everything that he considered worth attending to. "What do you write?" he asked. "Things I don't want to forget." He considered this. "What do you forget?" I looked at the journal, at the bent spine and the blood and the creek direction notes, and all the other entries going back years. The small indignities and private victories and moments of confusion that I'd trusted to paper, because I wasn't sure I could carry them all otherwise. "A lot," I said. "I forget a lot." He was quiet. "Then I do not write." He touched his temple, a gesture I read not as I remember everything, but as something more complicated. As if memory were a different kind of country for him. Not a place you visited to retrieve things, a place you lived in. I nodded. We sat with that difference between us, not as a wall but as a fact. The fire had burned down to coals. The canyon above us was beginning to show stars I could navigate by if I'd been paying attention earlier. Cress was standing sideways to the warmth with the boneless luxury of a horse who has decided she's safe. He had not, I noticed, asked me a single question about where I came from, who my father was, what outfit I rode for, or any of the first 10 questions a white man would have asked in the same situation. He'd asked me why. He'd asked me what I forgot. He'd asked me about my days. I turned these questions over in my mind like river stones, feeling for what made them different from the questions I'd have asked. I didn't have the answer by the time the coals died down, but I kept turning them. He fell asleep before dawn, not a decision, I think, but a body finally claiming what it needed after a day in a trap. He didn't crumple or soften. He lowered his back along the limestone and his breathing slowed, and even in sleep he seemed contained, self-governed, present in some essential way. I sat up and watched the stars and thought about a question my grandfather used to ask. Who needed who more? I'd been lost, he'd been caught, I'd freed the ankle. He'd given me the route home. I'd cleaned the wound. He'd given me something I couldn't name yet, something that had to do with the questions he'd asked and hadn't asked, the way he'd told me the land, the single word becoming, and what came after it. I was starting to think the question itself was wrong. That needing wasn't a scale where one side went up while the other went down. That 2 people could both be caught in different traps, and that the freeing could go in both directions at once. I didn't write that down. The journal felt wrong for it. Some things change when you put them into words, and I was afraid of what this would become in the writing before I'd finished understanding it. I let it sit, unwritten, unresolved, alive. The canyon filled slowly with the gray light that comes before color. The creek kept talking. I watched him sleep and felt, for the first time in 3 days, like I knew roughly where I was. Part 3. He was awake before I heard him move. One moment he was still, that deep, even stillness of a man who sleeps like someone who has learned not to make unnecessary noise, even unconscious. And the next he was sitting up, completely alert, his eyes already open and reading the canyon with the practiced sweep of a man who has never had the luxury of waking up slowly. No transition, no groggy middle, just, absent then present, fully and without reservation. I'd been watching the eastern ridge. The sky up there had gone from black to a deep violet gray that meant the sun was working its way up behind the rock. I'd been awake for maybe 2 hours, sitting with the cold and my thoughts and the journal in my lap that I still hadn't written in, and I'd been wondering what the morning was going to cost us, what it would require of both of us, in terms of decisions neither one of us could make for the other. He looked at the sky, then at the ankle, then at me. "You stayed," he said. 2 English words, but the way he said them, not a question, not exactly, but not a statement either, suggested that he'd woken up expecting something different, that he'd done some accounting in his sleep, and the numbers hadn't come out the way he thought they would. "Where would I go?" I said. "You gave me directions. I can't leave before light." I paused. "Also, you can't walk." Something happened in his face that I had learned, through the night, to read more carefully than I'd read any face in years. The Hawk assessment softened, just slightly, just at the edges, into something that was neither warmth nor distance, but some third thing between them that I didn't have a word for. He looked at the sky again. Then he said something in Apache, short and deliberate, that I understood was not meant for me to understand. More like thinking out loud, more like finishing a sentence he'd started in his sleep. The ankle was worse in the morning light, the way injuries always look worse in honest light than they do by firelight's mercy. The swelling had gone higher than I liked, into the calf, and the compression marks were a deep, angry purple. He looked at it with the same assessing neutrality he brought to everything, not minimizing, not catastrophizing, just, "Here is the information. Now decide." "You can't ride on this," I said. He looked at me. "For several days," I said, "maybe a week, depending." He absorbed this without visible reaction, but I'd learned to watch for the small things. The way his jaw adjusted. The slight shift in how he held his right hand, which had been resting on his knee, which now pressed down slightly into the ground, something to push against. "Your people know you're out here?" I asked. A pause. "They know I ride alone." "Will they look for you?" Another pause, longer. Something moved in his expression that was the first thing all night I'd have described as troubled. Not afraid, that wasn't the word. More like a man looking at the shape of a problem he hasn't solved yet and acknowledging its difficulty. "There is," he said slowly, choosing the English words with care, "a thing happening in the camp, a thing I must," he paused again, "must answer." I waited. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he'd decided not to tell me. Then, "There is a man, young, who says the old way is finished." He made a gesture I couldn't read precisely, but understood directionally, something about the camp, about tension, about the kind of argument that has 2 sides and a consequence. "He says to move, to go where they are not looked for." Another pause. "He is not wrong, but he is not all the way right either." I sat with this. "And you have to answer him." "I am the chief," he said, simply, the way you'd say I breathe. I thought about what he'd said the night before, becoming a story. The humiliation that wasn't in the iron, but in what the iron would mean, who would tell it, what they'd do with the telling. I thought about returning to camp with a wrapped ankle and 3 days of absence and a white cowboy's story that needed to not be told wrong. I thought about the young man in the camp who was not wrong, but not all the way right either, and what it cost to hold that distinction in your hands when everything around you was pushing toward one side or the other. "What will you tell them?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "I do not know yet." It was the first thing he'd said all night that sounded like uncertainty. Not weakness. Nothing about the way he said it suggested weakness. But uncertainty is not weakness. I know that better now than I did before that night, but I was starting to know it then. "That's honest," I said. "Yes," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, the weight of the single syllable, that made me think honesty cost him something. That for a man in his position, the luxury of not knowing was limited. That leadership is often the obligation to appear more certain than you are. I knew something about that. In a much smaller way, in a much smaller life, I knew something about that. I made breakfast with what I had, the remaining salt pork, heated this time, and the last of the coffee grounds I'd been rationing, brewed in the tin pot I'd used for the wound water, which I mentioned, and which he ignored with a diplomacy I found remarkable. We ate without ceremony. Cress nosed around the edges of the camp, expressing her opinion of the menu. He ate slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who has learned not to eat fast when food is present, because food is not always present. I recognized that quality from men I'd ridden with who'd grown up hard. That particular relationship with a meal, respectful without waste, no performance of appetite. I had 2 biscuits from 3 days ago that had become something between bread and geology. I offered one. He took it without comment and ate it in the same deliberate way, and I decided that was one of the more generous things I'd witnessed in recent memory. "I can go for help," I said when we'd finished. "Your camp if you can tell me the direction." No, immediate, unequivocal, then as if hearing his own sharpness. "Not your help, that help." I understood. Me showing up at an Apache camp to explain that their chief was incapacitated and located at a creek bend in the southern canyon was not a solution that improved anyone's situation. The story that would tell, the story that would be made from it, by people on both sides who would rather have a clean narrative than a true one, was not a story either of us wanted told. "All right," I said, "then what?" He was quiet for a moment. Thinking, that same hawk quality of attention turned inward. "You know this trail," he said finally. "The South Creek Trail where it bends." "I know it now," I said. "You told me." Something crossed his face at that, the fractional expression I'd been cataloging all night. That might have been the very beginning of something that, given enough time and different circumstances, could have become a smile. "There is a place," he said. 2 hours south on this creek, a fork, there will be riders." "Your riders?" "Looking for me?" He paused. "Maybe." "Should I ride south? When you find them, tell them." He paused, clearly translating not just language but the concept itself. What a stranger could say to his men that they would act on without the wrong kind of reaction. "Tell them the chief says, 'Come to the pine with the split crown.' Tell them he is well." I almost said, "He is not entirely well," but I understood what he meant. Well enough, present, not a story yet. "The pine with the split crown," I repeated. "You will see it when you come back this way." "When you come back," he said it as a certainty. I looked at him. He met my eyes with that same final quality, but this time there was something else in it. Something I didn't have a frame for until later, sitting in the saddle riding south, turning it over the way you turn those river stones. What I'd read as assessment had become something more like recognition. The difference between measuring a thing and knowing it. I saddled Cress while he watched. She was in a cooperative mood, which she extended to me perhaps 1 day in 3, and I chose to take it as a sign of something. I packed everything except the tin pot, which I left beside him with the remaining water I'd carried from the creek. He looked at it but said nothing. When I rolled the bedroll and tied it behind the saddle, he spoke. "You have a place," he said, "that you ride to." "Arroyo Mesa," I said. 2 days, maybe, your directions." He nodded. "You will go back there." "That's the plan." He was quiet. I checked the girth, adjusted the bridle, did the small, attentive rituals of a man preparing to ride. When I turned back, he was looking out at the canyon, at the morning light that had finally found the rim above us, and was working its way down in that slow, warming fall that makes the whole desert look like it's remembering something. "Callum," he said. It was the first time he'd used my name. "Yes," I said. He turned and looked at me directly. "The young man in my camp," he said, "who says the old way is finished." He paused. "He is right that the world is changing." I waited. "I was not sure," he said. "What kind of changing?" Another pause, not for translation this time, but for something else. Something being worked out in real time in front of me, which I understood was not something he did often and not something he did lightly. "I am more sure now." I looked at him. "2 men," he said. He gestured between us, not accusatory, not sentimental. "Just hear this thing here. Can sit in the dark with a fire between them, and in the morning still be—" He paused at the last word, seemed to test several options, finally settled on one. "Decent," he said. The word landed in my chest, like something I hadn't known I'd been waiting to hear. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that was worth the saying. I just stood there for a moment with my hand on Cress's neck and felt the word settle into whatever space it was going to occupy. He made a brief gesture, go, not dismissal, release. I mounted. Cress moved south along the creek without being asked, which was either intuition or the relief of finally having a direction. I rode maybe 40 feet before I stopped and turned. He was watching me go with that same complete hawk attention. The morning light had reached him now, and he was sitting against the limestone with his wrapped ankles stretched out and the tin pot beside him and the Freed trapped somewhere in the scrub behind the pine. And he looked, I struggled for the word then, struggle for it still. He looked like a man who had made a decision and found it solid under him. I raised my left hand, not a formal gesture, just, I see you, I was here. He raised his right hand once, a small motion complete. I turned south and rode. His riders were an hour and 40 minutes south of the Split Crown Pine, 2 men moving fast along the creek, with the focus of a search that hadn't yet found what it was looking for. They heard Cress before they saw me, and by the time I came around the bend, they had pulled up with a stillness that made my heart do something athletic, and I held up both hands immediately, which was the right instinct if not the most dignified posture. I said the words, the chief says, come to the pine with the split crown, he as well. They looked at me for a long moment, reading me the same way he had, that same assessing quality, though in these 2 men it was sharper and had a different edge. One of them said something to the other in Apache. The other one looked at my hands. At the journal sticking up from my breast pocket, with its bent spine and blood-stained cover. Then they turned north and rode hard, and I wheeled Cress east and gave her her head, and she ran the way she'd wanted to run for 3 days, and I let her. I made Arroyo Mesa before sunset the next day, which was the directions working exactly as promised. I didn't tell anyone at the outfit what had happened, not because I was ashamed of it, not because I was afraid of it, but because I understood, somewhere in the riding east with the wind in my face and Cress moving under me like something finally settled, that the story didn't belong to me. I had been in it. I was not the one who got to tell it. I wrote 3 lines in the journal that night in the bunkhouse, with the lamp turned low. A man can be lost and still find the thing that matters most. 2 fires, 1 night, different countries. The world is changing. The question is what kind. I read them back, decided they were insufficient, didn't cross them out. Some things are true, even when the words for them haven't arrived yet. 3 weeks later, and I don't know what this means, I have spent considerable time not knowing what it means. I heard from a rider passing through that a chief in the Southern Canyon Territory had announced, after an absence and a return, that his people would not move. That he had answers to the young man who was not all the way wrong. That the old way was not finished, but that it was going to have to learn some new things about what finishing wasn't. I was sitting at the outside table when the rider told this, eating my lunch, and the fork stopped moving in my hand. The rider didn't notice. He was already on to something else. I sat there in the afternoon sun and thought about a pine tree with a split crown, about morning light coming down a canyon wall, about the word decent and the weight it carries when it's earned in the dark. I put my hand in my breast pocket and felt the journal there, bent spine, worn strap, blood long since dried to brown. I didn't take it out. Some things you carry different than others. Some things you carry like a stone in your pocket that you chose to pick up. That's heavier than it looks, that you reach for without thinking when you're sitting still, and the world is asking you something you're not sure you know how to answer yet. You carry it until it becomes part of the weight you move through the world with.